Welcome to another deep dive edition of the Chicks on the Right podcast. We are very excited to have a special guest with us this week, Shane Cashman, who we discovered, who you are an author, you are also a staff writer for Timcast, and you have written some really interesting pieces as of late, one of which was a series about Kanye, which is actually how we sort of got this interview scheduled and how that all came to pass. And we're going to get to some of your more recent writings a little bit later in the show. But you are a bit of a mystery. And so we're going to talk about that first.
Totally. I looked. Well, welcome, first of all.
Hi.
Thank
you guys for having me. I appreciate it.
You
and
bet.
I'm sorry we had to postpone the last time. A lot has happened since we first started talking. But I'm really happy to be here and thank you guys.
Thank you for coming on. I always try to look up our guests online and try to do a little research on them and figure out like where they come from, where, you know, what they've done with their, like where they went to college, if they're married, if they have kids, if they have dogs, if they wear boxers or briefs, that sort of thing, because I like to know people. It's like, because everybody that when they do interviews, it seems like everybody wants to know, like, your job. Everybody's really interested in people's jobs. I'm more interested in people as people. And so there's not a whole lot about you.
That's weird.
Shane.
I feel like there is and there isn't. I mean, everything I've written, whether it was as a freelancer for different magazines over the last decade, even up to the newest stuff, I'm putting pieces of myself out there. But there was like a good 10, 12 years of me rotting inside of like colleges as a professor, where I was just kind of in the cave of teaching kids, which I loved. I loved teaching. I hated colleges like as a whole, as an institution. But no, I mean, I've been fairly open. A lot of the stories about, I wrote a piece for Fatherly a long time ago. I'm married. I have 2 young kids, and I was writing about raising my children for a little while on the farm where I grew up because we were fairly destitute. There was a time when we were kind of, I don't want to say we were living in a car, but we were living outside of the car and traveling around like the tri-state area in New York. And my wife and I were working multiple jobs at the time. I was a furniture mover. I was an adjunct professor at 2 different colleges, and I was a freelance writer, and my wife was a waitress all over the place. So, I'd write about things like that, growing up on this farm in the middle of the woods in New York, and, stuff like that. I'd written about my love of Mary Poppins, which I think is a love letter to the imagination. So there's a lot of things with me looking at, through the prism of my children, kind of reliving my childhood. But I was pretty much raised on this farm, lived there for a while. Then my wife and I moved to Brooklyn, took care of her grandfather for a few years, who had this terrible bone cancer in this old like bomb shelter Brooklyn apartment building. And then we kind of squatted there for a little bit after he passed away, got kicked out. Then that's where the car situation came into play. And then I started being a professor at multiple colleges. I taught fiction and poetry, essay writing, and, like English 101, mostly to kids who had English as a second language. So I was doing some writing there, but it was kind of sparse. There was like a good year as a freelancer for me was getting like a feature article in a magazine once a month, which was like, it wasn't like a ton of money, but it helped, supplement all the other jobs we had. And at that time I was writing about historical things such as like missing skeletons in West Point, New York. I was writing about a guy who makes a living as Teddy Roosevelt. He's performed at the White House. I've been writing about the history of the air conditioner and how it's associated with like an assassination of a president. And I just realized after a while that the colleges weren't going to go anywhere. I was disgusted with what was happening inside of colleges. All the things that we probably all hear about happening inside of colleges are very true, at least in the ones I was working in. I realized no matter how good I was doing as a professor, and no matter how much I loved teaching, there was just no upward mobility in that place for me, at least. So COVID happened. You're sent home. I was forced to teach on Zoom. I despise teaching on Zoom. No offense to this right here, but when you're trying to teach a class of like 15 students to talk about how to honestly critique each other, Zoom was not the situation. We needed to be in a room and like body language and really look at each other in the face and tell each other, deep thoughts about these things. So basically, there's a whole bunch of problems with the colleges. COVID kind of shined a light on a lot of them for me personally, and I ended up having to quit, and I had nothing lined up. But a few months prior, I happened to hear Tim Pool on his show, his nightly show on IRL, talk about needing someone to write weird stories about, like ghosts, true crime, UFO stuff, and that kind of fell in line with a lot of the stuff I'd been doing previously for places like Atlas Obscura. And I just so happened that like a week after or 2 weeks after I quit the college job, Tim hit me up. I came down to his studio, and then I got a job, and then that turned into me doing what I'm doing now.
That's awesome.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because
Yes.
that has been quite the things that you've done recently. Just because no offense, but I don't think anybody would have recognized the name Shane Cashman last summer.
Oh, yeah,
right,
for sure.
And then all of a sudden, this whole explosion with Kanye on set with Tim Pool, and then walking out, and then all of that happening led you. And I understand, and I think anybody does that reads that piece that you did about Kanye. You're a huge fan
Yeah.
of Kanye,
Yeah.
and so you were talking to him as in the wake of all of the like Hitler comments that he made, in the wake of all of the drama that was surrounding Kanye. And so I know some people were pretty upset with you just for giving him that platform, giving him that attention, and most of all, talking about him as a viable presidential candidate.
Yeah.
So I love the way that you tell a story.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But I wonder if some of that like fandom of him clouded your ability at all.
Oh, yeah.
To recognize like how angry he has made people.
I even like dance with that subject in that series because I'm constantly kind of toggling between my own objectivity and subjectivity because I'm telling the reader, I'm borderline obsessed with this guy's art. When I was a professor, I think I said this in the story, I would have a class debate who was more relevant, Shakespeare or Kanye, which is based on an Oxford debate at Oxford. So I'm sure it did. And I was trying to be open with the audience, being like, I'm certainly infected with a bias towards this guy. However, I'm also trying to show people that my whole life, for whatever reason, I've admired people or artists who do this thing where they kind of throw grenades in the culture, and then everyone's telling me that they're horrible. And they might be, and I'm willing to accept that fact, but I'm also like, it might not be exactly as bad as you think, because I grew up, having problems listening, people telling me gangster rap was bad. I get it. There's a lot of bad stuff with that. I don't know what it is about it, but I love it. I loved a lot of metal growing up that people told me was bad. But it's always been something where like the things I've been attracted to have been controversial, whether it was, my own mom worried about it, taking me to the pediatrician to be like, what is wrong with my son? Why does he like these things? He's rapping ridiculous things at home. I'm coming home rapping like Big Pun lyrics and Tupac, and my mom's like, what is happening to my child? But I just tend to, want to hear this other side of the person when there's a giant, whether it's Fox 5 or NBC or, people on Twitter or whatever it is telling me something's bad. I just need to see I like to be able to see the person. And when I was younger, all I had was the artwork to be like, well, I'm experiencing this in a different way than you're telling me you're interpreting it. And it just so happened with Kanye, I had the chance to be with him and share his side of the story, and also tell the reader, like, I definitely have my flaws. I definitely am going back and forth between objectivity and subjectivity. But this is the story. I look up to authors like Joseph Mitchell's an author I would always teach. And he would always write these long essays about people who were on the fringes of society in like the 50s and 40s. So that's kind of like what I feel like my model is for a lot of the stuff I'm doing today, is these people who are pushed into quote unquote exile by society. I'd like to hear them talk, and then the reader can decide how they feel about them and me in the end.
Yeah, what a great concept. Yeah. Going back to you teaching, I know this, I'm kind of zigzagging here, but Mock said that you really are a great storyteller, and I absolutely agree with that. You're a fantastic storyteller, and I love the way that you're just like long form. You get kind of caught up in the way that you write. I swear I'm not sucking up. I just think that is like it's just it's something that you don't see very much of anymore, and that's why I wanted to touch on it. I was going to ask you, since you taught, do kids even freaking read anymore? Like, that's why I was asking, because so much, because we're in the space where it's all internet, and one thing I've noticed over the past 14 years of doing what we do is that we've almost had to shorten a lot of because we used to write long form stuff on our site. Yep. We don't do that as much anymore because people's attention spans are so short. Yeah. Do you ever find that frustrating? Just curious as a writer.
Yeah, I mean, I will never change the way I write to appease an audience that doesn't have the bandwidth for what I want to do. Because it's just how I write. I can't change it. I mean, I could if I forced myself, but this is the kind of writing that makes me feel good. It hits a certain note in my head that I like, and I put it out there knowing it's not going to be read at length, knowing it'll be picked apart just for being so long. Our kids love to read. Our 6-year-old is going through Harry Potter right now, and he can't stop listening to the audiobooks. And he's doing Narnia. We're into C.S. Lewis. I love C.S. Lewis. Mm-hmm. He hasn't gotten past Narnia yet, but I can't wait to show him other C.S. Lewis things. But they love to be told stories, but that's because they have parents who love to read. Right. And when I was a teacher, definitely students didn't want to read. I remember giving them one of my favorite pieces of writing is Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. And these kids hated it. They're like, why do I have to read this? I'm like, dang, this is like Martin Luther King Jr., but all right. But I realized they will read. You just have to make them excited about the words. And so I would tailor their writing exercises and the things they read to things I know they like. So kind of like how we started this podcast, I would start the classes with them being like, okay, what do you guys like? Let's make a whole list of things. I love to talk about literally anything that anyone's excited to talk about. So once I know what they are into, whether it's music or dirt bikes, really whatever, it could be Tamagotchis, it could be Pokemon, I don't care. Once we have that pinned down, then they feel like, oh, I can write about this forever. And then we'll talk about word length and what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
So going back to the Kanye thing, what is your relationship with him now? Yeah. Because it seemed like, I mean, he really took you under his wing. He's like, here, we're going there, we're going everywhere. And then there was this amazing, 2-part story that you did. So where is your relationship now? What do you feel like has been the result of that work? Do you feel like you gave people a new perspective about Kanye that they didn't? Have you seen any actionable sort of change from what you wrote about him?
There's definitely some people who reached out and said they're happy I put him in a different light, or they see what he did, or they can look past the headlines that were made after the InfoWars situation, where they might have only heard one part, but they didn't hear the other part where it's he says the Hitler stuff. He also says, I love Jews. And for me, again, I'm telling people, I'm coming at this from someone who liked Andy Kaufman. I'm telling Kanye this. I know he likes Andy Kaufman. And it's these people who kind of walk the line of reality and fantasy, which I really enjoy. I heard from a lot of people who enjoyed it. I heard from a lot of other people who you're not going to change their minds, and that's fine. I'm extremely proud of that story. I feel like I got to do something that was I made a time capsule of that specific situation in regards to how I felt about this society through the prism of Kanye in that weekend where a lot of things were happening. And then my relationship with him is, we haven't talked probably in, I would say a month or so, but there was a good 2 weeks when I came home where he would just call me and start rapping ideas, and I'd be with my wife. I'd be like, oh my goodness, Ye's calling. And he would just crazy. He would tell me ideas. He'd rap some bars, and then he would have me write ideas out, and it would happen in real time. It was so bizarre where he would have me write down things in real time while I'm on speakerphone in his car, and then he's making me read them. I'm like, dude, I'm not that I write really long stories. They take me a few days at least to write. And now I'm writing lyrics on my phone while he's listening to me, and he's expecting stuff. And like I said, he's one of my favorite artists. So, but he would listen to me, and then he'd hear a word or a phrase he would like. Then he would go on a tangent and then rap something else. So I got to see more behind the scenes of him creating, which was really exciting. It was like, it reminded me a lot of the workshops in my classrooms where we were just kind of freestyling ideas, and he'd be a very harsh critic of certain things. And I'd be like, all right, that's fine. Like I'm learning. Like I love that. So that went on for a little while. And then, I think he just kind of had to disappear for a bit. And then I just don't like, I feel like I could hit him up all the time if I want to be like, I'm listening to your song right now, da, 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 da. But he went away, like he kind of always does when he does, he makes the culture, he sets it on fire, then he disappears for a little bit. This time he did the same thing, except this time he came back married, so.
Yeah.
Is he going to run, do you think? Like, is he actually going to make a go at the presidency?
I believe he will, yeah. I really do. I
will
really
he run,
do.
Will genuinely think that he's a good candidate? Like, for real?
I do believe he could be a good candidate. I can't speak to his platform. I mean, I saw his platform. I can't talk about it yet because he's like, it's secret to him, and I don't want to do that to him. But he's got a platform that I read that I think a lot of people who don't, I don't want to say, because like the right and left doesn't even mean anything to me anymore. Like, it's just, but people who lean more conservative or hate what the left has done with progressivism, I think there's a lot of the stuff in this platform that people will be like, oh, I like that. There's other things, and I address this in the story, I think in part 2, where I'm like, where there's things I don't agree with, which, if those things come into play, I'm not going to be so cool with it. They're talking about rewriting the Constitution, which sounds like a kind of ridiculous, kind of very egotistical thing to say. But my concern was a lot of those things could lead to blasphemy laws. And I don't understand who's in charge of making blasphemy laws, because I don't trust any authority. And I definitely don't trust, even if you believe in the authority today, tomorrow's authority could be completely tyrannical and unjust. And like I told him in the story, if you create this society that will have these new blasphemy laws, which some of them I can get behind because I think we are a wicked and corrupt and deranged society. They could, though, be used against people like a young Kanye, that like these young artists couldn't exist in that world. I also don't believe in saying that only a certain type of religion can run for office. I understand why we could all agree on that. And I understand the sentiment behind it, but it just, to me, doesn't feel like that's the move. That's not the move.
And that's what he wants? That's
what people in his camp want. I don't know if he specifically wants that, but I talked to a lot of those people he was with, whether it was Nick,
and that guy.
Yeah.
I mean,
so it's a little anti-freedom, is what you're saying.
There's things that are very pro-freedom, but there's things that are very anti-freedom, anti-individual.
Right.
So a lot of these things I love. I'm so into it. I'm like, I want to shut down all the alphabet agencies. As ridiculous as that sounds, I'm over it. I get rid of the IRS for all I care. I'm done with a lot of it. I want a very small government. I do appreciate that. And there was things where I was telling him, I think the government has abused its citizens for decades. And one of my biggest problems, you look at what our government did to the men at Tuskegee with giving people syphilis and just studying them. We did the same thing to Guatemala, where we just inject these diseases into people and kind of sit back and watch what happens. That to me is completely evil. So when I'm talking to him about it, he gets that, and I appreciate that. And I appreciate that he could have this platform where he could talk about things like human trafficking. He could talk about these horrible experiments that are done on our own people. So I like all of that. But there's those other things I'm talking about, which I can't get behind, because I believe in free will. I believe in the individual. But he is extremely serious, as far as I can tell. I will not be surprised if he is actually running. I bet what he wants to do is beyond the debate stage, which would be interesting to watch. But we're in a world that's post-Trump, where anything's possible. So that's why I won't discredit anyone at this point.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we wouldn't need to rewrite the Constitution to get rid of the IRS. That's one thing. We could just do that, because the founders didn't want it anyway.
Yeah,
but it's very interesting. True. And you're right. It is a post-Trump era, and anything goes. It's like that opened the Pandora's box, right?
Yep.
So
for better or for worse.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
So your next piece that you did late December was about Kari Lake, and I was really interested to read that you actually went to the court to the court battle that she had when she was suing Katie Hobbs over the whole, the Maricopa County results and all of that. And it's still, she's pursuing that. I understand. But you came away from being there with a really infuriating story about it was NBC, right? The NBC journalist that was there, and how just nobody was actually listening to what was being said. So your takeaway was that, there was some major fuck-uppery going on in that whole voting system. So how do you feel about where our elections are in general?
My distrust points in every direction in this country right now. I love America. I love this country. And I'm just deeply saddened by the amount of distrust I think we've all started having with every institution, whether it's the universities or it's our own election systems. That court case was interesting because you're watching people discuss what looks like broken chains of custody with ballots. You're looking at those ballots that were 19-inch ballots printed on 20-inch paper, which they said were being rejected by the machines. And it was just kind of like this odd, it's like I wanted to hear it, so I'm very reluctant to be like, oh, now I'm hearing it. So it's just like this confirmation bias, because I went into it being like, I don't trust any of this anyway. But I'm trying to listen. Both sides are talking, but when you're watching people talk about things that seem nefarious, whether it was the wait times, the ballots being rejected, the printing problems. I think there was at one point when they said they knew there was an issue happening, but they didn't address it or even say anything publicly, and they didn't even discuss it until day 2 or 3 of that trial. All these things, I'm like, this is something. Maybe it's not this evidence of this widespread problem, but something bizarre is happening here. And I'm sitting next to NBC guy, and he's just taking 20 minutes to send out a tweet about someone he likes this person who's on the stand right now because they're speaking out against Kari Lake's team. And so he's tweeting forever about what he heard them say. Meanwhile, he's not listening to the rest of the debate or the counter arguments. And it was just, I walked away feeling very, very sad for the state of media, which is nothing really new for me. It's not so unique. I feel that way already. But to be inside of that room, to watch this guy with the perfect hair who had the van outside with the camera crew, then go report on his side of the world as he saw it, with an air of objectivity, but it was just a mask. The objectivity it's fake, People want objectivity. I want objectivity. I don't really write completely objective ever, but this guy goes out there with the whole getup, pretending to be the authority on objectivity, but he's just giving you a very skewed look on reality, and he's got that like condescending tone that he uses. Where I just started noticing that stuff. Probably around 2015 when there were different local news outlets that would report on Trump or any, right-leaning candidate. It would seem to be objective, but there was a certain way they would talk about it. Right. They'd frame it a certain way or use certain words or certain tones that was screaming subjectivity. So, I think something's totally corrupt with our country, with pretty much every institution. Our election systems, I don't think, can be trusted. And our media is like an arm of the government, especially the corporate media, that does their bidding, where they go out and they pretend to be objective and they sell you this like perfect little manicured idea of truth. And people who don't have time to, go and do all the crazy research that people in our world do, they sit home at the end of the day after a long day of work, taking care of their family, paying their bills, and they expect the objectivity to come through their TV screen, which is a problem. And they hear this guy talk and they take him at face value, and that's it. And that's how we start to warp our reality, which is an extreme problem.
Yeah, and then who are the journalists these days? Who are they?
I like a few journalists. I detest journalism. Modern journalism is terrible. I mean, I love a lot of journalists. There's some that I like. I love Whitney Webb. She's one of my favorite journalists right now. I love what she does. I love Taibbi. There's a bunch out there doing great work, but journalism is a wasteland, and is a lot of people pretending to be objective about certain things, but even when they frame things, that is a lack of objectivity by you not showing things. That's why when writing, I probably call myself a journalist every now and then. I consider myself a writer, but I'm just like, I'm like, this is how I'm thinking about all this stuff. So clearly it's subjective. And these are all my angles, and you take it or leave it. And if you like it, you like it. That's great. I'm not going to change your minds. Maybe I will, but I just think journalism is in a very sad place, because a lot of it seems to be people virtue signaling to their own team, or just trying to get one over on the people that they perceive to be their political opponents. And then Twitter just makes it all worse, because there's a lot of journalists who go out of their way to just kind of like instigate problems. But the reason I like doing what I do is I just talk to people, and, that's all I can do. I wish I could do the stuff that Whitney Webb does. I think she's probably one of the most important journalists alive right now. Along with, a few others.
Okay, so let me ask you then, because the criticism that you're getting, and you're getting a lot for your Eliza Blue story.
Yeah.
Would you do, because you said that you called yourself a journalist sometimes.
Yeah.
Were you a journalist when you talked to Eliza Blue?
That's a good question.
When you wrote that story?
Probably, I think I refer to myself as one, for lack of a better word, but I'm not the investigative journalist that I think people wanted me to be.
I think that's fair, because there's a lot of people who are asking the question, why in all of that hullabaloo did you not reach out to some of the people who claim that the biggest piece of that story, which was the censorship part, why did you not reach out to those people to get their story and learn the things that they had uncovered?
Well, two things with that. I had spent 2 weeks listening to all those people live stream every day, taking super chats, making money, saying everything they want to say. And I understood that. I think most of the questions I asked Eliza were based on the people with those questions doing that, who, there's a number of them. And the other thing was, I was planning to write an entire story on one or two of those people separate of the Eliza thing. But then throughout the writing of that story, and if you've read that series, you'll the second I landed in Illinois, in Quad City, my name was out there as a person going to write this story. So now I'm like in the story. I'm typically always in my stories, but now I'm like in the story, which I don't ever like to be like while I'm writing, because I just don't like writing under that kind of like situation. But I was, and then that becomes a part of the story. And the censorship angle was something I kind of pressed Eliza on, because, her answer to that when we got to that was, well, that video is not public. And I said, but it was public when people shared screenshots from that video. She said, well, it's not anymore. I'm like, but it was when people shared it. So then her side of the story was, that her legal team has some case that's ongoing with that video, and that they shared something that, according to her and according to this case number, which I couldn't see, was proof enough for these places to take down that video. So that was her side of the story. But and as that's happening, as people now know I'm the one out there writing the story, they want me to be an investigative journalist. They want me to be this thing that I've kind of never been. I've always been the person that just goes out and talks to the person in the face of the controversy, especially with the Kari Lake and the Kanye stories. But at a certain point, I was just so disgusted with people and how they were attacking me, anyone in the periphery of the story, where I was like, I've heard enough from them. I'm disgusted. I was going to write a whole story on these people. I had their contact. I was ready to go. Even though I felt like I had a pretty good handle on what they were saying with the censorship stuff, which I get, because I don't like censorship either. But I became disgusted with how they were acting, because at a certain point, these people, some of them, were like giving people that in my team ultimatums on what they should talk about, how they should address this. And I'm like,
we got some of that too.
And I'm like,
totally.
You're not like, you sound like a Batman villain at this point. Like, I'm not going to acquiesce to these ultimatums. To me, that's disgusting. Right. It's one thing to ask questions. Questions are great. I had all the same questions most of them had. But when it gets to like this like maliciousness and these like weird personal attacks and going after people's families, doing these things, these weird threats I was getting, like these like death threats, these pseudo death threats, these people sharing the address where I was staying out there. At a certain point, I'm like, well, now I'm not going to talk to these people, because there's no good faith in that. Mm-hmm. There is good faith in asking questions, because the whole story, Eliza's whole story was under pressure. I was going out there at first, to interview someone. And like I say in the story, I was going out there to kind of interrogate her. A lot of people will say, well, I didn't interrogate her enough, but that's just not my style. I asked her a lot of questions I'd rather not ask anybody. And like what I said to her, or I said to the story, I think I said it to her and in the story, I'm either going to expose some like psychotic elaborate lie that she's constructed, or I'm going to make this person relive some terrible trauma I wouldn't wish on anybody. That aside, no amount of her lying, if she's lying, would warrant the kind of attack I saw coming from the camps that, these people who I then refused to talk to, because I was just disgusted. I was disgusted. And that's where I went with that. So people had in their minds when they found out it was me going out there that I would be the person to investigate this to a degree that is just not what I do. Everything I've done, I go out and talk to the person who is in this type of digital war zone. I get their side of the story. I give all my weird thoughts and imaginations, and then the reader can decide for themselves how they feel about it. When Kanye did his thing, I didn't go out and talk to like the Jewish community to get their side of the point of view.
Right.
When I did Kari Lake, I didn't go to Katie Hobbs to give her side of the view. I could have, but that's just not what I do. At another point, maybe I would.
That's very fair.
But
I think it's fair.
I think they just wanted me to be a thing that I'm not. And that's fine. I don't expect people to like what I do. I write very long stories with a lot of weird ideas and images in them. But those are the stories that I'm proud of. And I'm always going to try to do my best. And I love the criticism. There's obviously a lot of criticisms that I could take and do things better. But
is the story going to go back up?
That's a good question.
It was taken down.
That's a good question.
So...
Yeah, I don't know. I was not in the room for that decision, so I don't know yet. We're still kind of parsing through all of that. I would love to see it go back up. I wrote soon after the third piece went up, I wrote an update with this extra interview that then came out as the addendum. I wish that came out with the third piece and everything went back up, but there was so much heat happening on our side in terms of like the threats, the harassment, all this stuff where I think people wanted to just be done with it, which I totally understand. It affected my family. The kind of threats we were getting doesn't feel good. I don't like living that way. I don't like being confrontational. I don't like having to open up any part of my phone and getting inundated with these ridiculous messages. But my wife and I sat down before I even flew out there, and we made a list of everything people were going to say. All the stuff. I'm sleeping with this person. I'm doing that. She's sleeping with this person. I'm a simp. Everything. And by the time I was there, that whole list came true. So we had an idea of what was going to happen just because of how like hot that story was and like the way Twitter was on fire. But we underestimated the degree to which the threats and the harassment would happen. And then, obviously my team just got tired of it. Like, I was too. It was very taxing to have to get inundated with some of these messages. The questions are one thing, and wanting me to be a different type of writer, that's fine too. But I think everyone's just like, we can't continue like this.
Yeah,
which I get.
I think that's fair because even in the past 14 years, we've been called people have called us journalists or wanted us to be journalists, and we're like, seriously, have you seen us? Like we don't. And furthermore, it's actually an insult to be called a journalist.
That's how I feel.
I don't want to be called.
That's
a
how I
journalist,
feel.
So.
That's how I feel. But I still think journalism is a great art form that we need to start perfecting again and get back to it. If we could, but
if we get it right in the schools. If we can get it right,
the schools,
man, it's like Miriam. It's like Mock always says. It's like putting toothpaste back in the tube. It's like so hard to do that.
Yeah,
so,
I have hope for it, and journalism doesn't have to always be this one simple objective type of article. It can be under the kind of stuff I do, like this Joseph Mitchell stuff. It could be very straight, reporting. We need that as well, but. Social media, as great as it is, has mutated journalism into this other thing that people expect everyone to do a certain type of thing, so long as it makes them feel good about the way they feel about a certain situation. My personal integrity, I would have felt like I lost a piece of myself if I then went and wrote a story that everyone was demanding I write. That wasn't going to happen.
I think in your case, I think there was undue and unwarranted pressure for you to be an investigative journalist when that's not your bag. And I think had people just realized you going into this, you're just going to write a story about a chat that you're having with Eliza. Yeah, you're going to have some tough questions,
Yep.
But you're not. This isn't supposed to be like a whole investigative.
Yeah.
psyop into like all the pieces and parts, and I totally get that, and we'll get the same criticism for not pressing you further in this interview, although
I'm
we're
sure.
up against a hard break, unfortunately.
I'm sure. I'm
Even
sorry.
though I would love to.
Right.
I am
No,
sorry.
that's okay. Listen, it's okay. No, we're used to that. But that's one thing that we can push back on too, because we're not what they think we are
Right.
either. We're not journalists either, and we have no intention to be.
Right. Yeah. It should, and that should be okay, you know. And I get like a lot of people didn't know who I was before Kanye. Obviously, I was writing mostly like weird true crime stories, but even those stories were me in the story like losing my mind. So I have this kind of weird apocalyptic bent to my writing where I'm also putting myself in these situations that I get, but people weren't familiar with that. A lot of people built up a certain feeling towards Eliza, which a lot of it was just because they didn't know anymore. Who was this person? Mm-hmm. They believe she was one thing. Maybe she's not. But then, you know, I'm in the mix and they are not familiar with the Kari Lake story or the Kanye thing or how I write. So I get it. I'm not really mad at those people because who am I? You know, I'm just another schmuck who's been thrown out of a newsroom into the story to write this ridiculous thing. It just so happened in my mind, you know, the Eliza thing, the Kari Lake and the Kanye I see them all as like this trilogy of controversy of this person who's been digitally exiled or stoned digitally, you know, by their community. And I'm just happen to be there and I'm going to share their story. And that's the best I can do.
Yeah.
And this is the perfect way to wrap this up. And we both appreciate your time really so much, Shane.
Thank you.
This was really, really interesting. I feel like we could get so much further into it if we had more time.
Yeah, definitely.
But I appreciate you being candid about your answers and explaining what your style of writing is. And hopefully that, you know, can quell some of the naysaying, although I know it will
never. It will never.
And we're going to be next on the chopping block because of how we've conducted this interview. So we're used to it. It's fine.
Well, we appreciate it, Shane. It was lovely to meet you
Thank
and
you.
to learn more about you.
Thank you.
And we wish you all the best in the future.
Thank you. I appreciate
Can't
it.
wait to read more.
I appreciate it. Thank you guys for talking
so
to me.
much.
Thank you. Have a great one.
Thank you.